So welcome everyone. My name is Pat Sauer. Pleased to introduce Dr. Tom Rosberg with Drake University. And this is, it's hard to believe, our last webinar of the season. And Tom said, you know, I wasn't sure we were going to find enough plants this time of year, but we did. So, and actually a little reminder that if you could please use the chat area, or you have the ability to unmute yourself. And someone actually who just joined us needs to mute themselves, please. And you can unmute yourself and ask questions or use the chat area. And one item that I'm going to ask for is, so last year we looked at woodland, wetland, and prairie species across the state and did road tours. This year this season I should say, we looked at weeds and invasives. So if there's something in particular that you might want to look at next year, let us know, because we will start planning during the winter months. So let us know. So I'm going to, before I hand it over to Tom, and don't forget Tom to, no, I think we're okay. I need to start oh, no, we are recording. So, okay. So with that, Tom, if you could give us a brief introduction of the site. And then we do have Tiffany Wilson-Lillard with ISWEP. She's behind the scenes and she will start and stop the video as we go through. So I'll hand it over to you, Tom.
All right, thanks, Pat, and good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining us this morning. This is the last webinar of the season, and I told Pat that it was going to be probably hard to find new invasive or weedy species. We'd seen, most of the invasives that you're going to run across in Iowa over the first three sessions. So this one does just kind of look at whatever we can find. And a few of them are not so good species, are problem species. Many others are just interesting native plants. So hopefully it'll be worth your time. We spent some time at Chia Fen in Johnson County. This is an 80-acre preserve way up in the northeast corner of the county, about 5 miles south of Lisbon. If you get a chance, it's really worth your visit. And time spent there hiking around. Its namesake is a wetland called Chia Fen, but the site is on a landscape that is primarily built from sand, aeolian sand deposits from the Cedar River. The Cedar River is only about a couple miles, or maybe a mile and a half or so to the west. So there's basically a remnant sand prairie, and I would say black oak, white oak, sand savanna there. And nestled in this sandy landscape, in this these sand deposits, are some wetlands. There are basins that collect water from the permeability of the sand, and one of them has developed some peat. So the term fen or bog is used to describe a wetland that is characterized by significant amounts of peat. We might be able to talk about this later. Again, it's called a Chia Fen. There's some controversy, I guess I would say. I look at it a little bit differently in terms of how to classify a wetland like this. I prefer to call it a bog, but either way, that wetland is a very interesting community with some very unusual plants. And the sand prairie in general has promoted, again, an ecosystem that has some unusual species. I noticed that there's 225 plant species have been documented from the site. There's some special concern species like cleft phlox, lance leaf violet, nodding lady's tresses, Blanding's turtle, six-line race runners, bull snake, and a couple of damselflies. So yeah, if you get a chance to visit it, it's a lot of fun.
Okay, so Tiffany, if you could start the video, please.
Okay, I'm going to share my screen now, and you should be able to see my screen. I'm going to go to the player here. Can you guys see?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. Let me just maximize that, and I'm starting now.
this is Tom Rosberg. I'm here with Noah from ISWEP. We're going to do one more video here for a webinar on invasive plants. We are located this morning in Johnson County at a site called Chia Fan Preserve. It's owned by Johnson County Conservation Board. As Noah pans around, you can see there's some beautiful large savanna oaks here. These are probably black oaks from what I can tell. This is a sand deposit area, wind-blown sand deposit on the east side of the Cedar River, not too far from little town of Sutliff. We're going to try and see what we can find here for invasive plants, but you know, this is the fourth one now. We've seen a lot of invasive plants. I think what we'll do, just to kind of make it more quick and simple, is we'll just do some hiking around. We'll stop at certain spots and we'll just take a look at what we can find. Some of the plants will be non-native, and maybe they'll be invasive or not. But basically, this will be more of a little webinar on late season plants, probably what we find blooming in late September. Things like asters and goldenrods, some of the other late species. Okay, we're going to start with some of the goldenrods. Again, the goldenrods we have in Iowa, there aren't any that are non-native or really that invasive. They can be somewhat of a problem, though, in restorations in that they can be aggressive and kind of start taking over areas. So again, having some ability to tell which goldenrods you have might be helpful. There are probably three species that kind of stand out as being pretty common in open habitats, grassland environments, reconstructions. All three of them are native, and they are fairly tall. So we're looking at one of those three right here. They have this plume-like inflorescence. So among the goldenrods, there are some that have this plume-like flowering structure, or there are some that have more of a flat top structure. So we can divide them into two groups on that basis. The three that we're going to be talking about, again, have this plume-like structure with kind of arching branches. They also have three main veins. I don't know if Noah can zoom in enough to see the three main veins. They have the central vein, and then there's two lateral veins there that stand out fairly strongly. So there's three main veins. They're called triple-nerved or triple-veined species. So we're talking about those three species that have those two characteristics. One of them is giant goldenrod, and we don't see that here. It's a little bit more of a wetter soil species. But the way to start with these is to look at the pubescence on the stem, see if there's pubescence on the stem, and then look up into the inflorescence up here where the flowers are and see if there's pubescence or hairiness in here. Giant goldenrod will have hairiness up in here. There'll be hairs up in here on these branches, but there won't be any down here. The stem will be glabrous. Let me just check to make sure which one we have here. Yeah, there are some hairs on the stem here, so this is not giant goldenrod. It's one of the other two then. The other two species have hair on the stem, and they have hair up here. When we try to separate those two species, it gets a little bit more difficult. Those two species are Solidago altissima, tall goldenrod, and Solidago canadensis, Canada goldenrod. What I always have to do is, if it's one of those two species, I just pluck one of these branches off, or just part of the flowering structure up here, and take it home with me, because the best way to separate those two species is to take one of the little flowers here, the flower heads, and look at the disc florets that are in the center of that head, and measure the length of the corollas, the petals. And if that corolla is 3 millimeters or more in length, that's going to be Solidago altissima, the tall goldenrod. If it's smaller than that, then you've got Solidago canadensis. Another way to kind of get a rough idea, and it's hard to tell, again, what the size of those corollas are, even with just a hand lens out here. That's why I take them home and put them under a scope. But just looking at the leaves here, it looks like this might be altissima, because when you look at the leaves here, there are some teeth, but they're very weakly developed. So it's very weakly serrate. The margins of these leaves, there's some tiny little teeth. There's not very many of them. They're not very big. So again, Solidega altissimus tends to have teeth on the margins of the leaves, but they're very, very fine, very small teeth. Solidega canadensis leaves have teeth as well, but they're more conspicuous and larger. So that's three of the more common goldenrods that we might see out here. Again, not sure, but I'm guessing this one is tall goldenrod based on the leaves. All right, let's see what else we can find growing right here amongst us. There's some asters here, another important species this time of year. And this one right here is a very common one called frost aster, Aster pilosus, or the new name in Florida, North America, Symphylotrichum pilosum. So when you get into the asters, of course, things can get challenging. This is obviously one of the white asters, and it's also one that has a lot of branching. We can look at a little bit more of the plant here. You can see how much branching this plant shows. So when you do the white asters, the thing that's probably most similar to this one that you might confuse it with would be heath aster. Heath aster is Aster ericoides. They both have white flowers. The ray flowers are white. Heath aster has smaller flowers. Frost aster has a little bit bigger flowers, so there's one difference there. You can kind of get a sense. These are a little bit bigger than heath aster. The best way to be sure about things is to take a look at the involucral bracts, which are these little green structures that sit right below the ray flowers. It's a series of little structures called involucral bracts right there. And what I'm looking at, when I look at those, to sort of clarify and verify this is frost aster, is the tips of those bracts. On frost aster, the tips of those bracts are enrolled a little bit. So the top portion of those bracts towards the tip curves or rolls inward, making a little bit of a short little tube, you might say, at the very tip. Also, the whole involucral bract tends to have a shape that is described sort of as an urn, so kind of a broader base, and as you go up, it kind of becomes more narrow. So again, that's some of the couple of the characteristics that help. I think frost aster is generally somewhat of a weedy species. It can be, again, it's a native species, but it can be pretty aggressive in terms of reconstructions. I have a prairie reconstruction at home that I just mowed a large portion of it because it was just chock full of this stuff. It was really dense. The frost aster was very, very dense, very thick. It came up on its own from the seed bank, and there's way too much of it. So because it's in flower right now, this was a good time to mow it. All right, so Chia Fan again is where we're at.
Okay, we will pause at this point. If anyone has any questions on any of the species or management of the species that Tom has mentioned, feel free to use the chat area to ask questions, or you can temporarily unmute yourself and ask questions. Anyone at all? Or Tom, do you have any comments on those species?
Well, just one more thing about the asters, the frost aster versus the heath aster. Usually the heath aster is a smaller plant. Usually it's found on more higher quality sites. It's not quite as weedy as frost aster is. Heath aster has smaller leaves as well. And when you look at the involucral bracts on heath aster, you don't see that curved or enrolled tip as I was describing. Instead, at the very tip of the involucral bracts, there's a little short spine. It's pretty easy to see with a hand lens. So it is a pretty easy distinction separating those two. There are some other similar looking white flowered asters, but they're pretty uncommon. They're asters that grow mainly out in grassland environments. There's some other white ones that grow in forests. I'm talking about those that would be more out in a sunny grassland type of environment. Aster parviceps is one, and Aster falcatus, but both of those are pretty uncommon. And in fact, Aster falcatus, I think, has only been found in just a couple of places, so somewhat rare. So of the white asters out in open grassy areas, it's going to mainly be those two species, either frost or heath.
Okay, I'm not seeing any questions. Tiffany, you want to start the video again, please?
And this is a habitat, again, that's dominated by a lot of sand. It's was historically partly savanna and partly prairie. So what we're looking at here is mostly species you'd find in those kinds of environments. We're going to take a look at some things again we see right down here in front of us. I did find one species that is non-native. I'll pluck a leaf here and pull it up here so you can get a better look at it. So this is one of the basal leaves, and it's a pretty easy one to recognize because of the palmately compound leaf. These are all leaflets here, and they, of course, are arranged what we call palmately because they all come to a common point where they are attached. Maybe you can kind of see in the light there as I move it around, there's some pubescence. I can kind of see that silvery hairs on the surface of those leaves. So it's got some pubescence. There's the back. It's got very clear serrated margins there, very strongly and fairly coarsely toothed margins. This is called sulfur cinquefoil, Potentilla erecta. Potentilla erecta is a species that's not native to Iowa, and you find it out in pastures and grasslands, degraded prairies. I would say that it's pretty harmless as far as its aggressiveness goes. I would not really put it into an invasive species category. And again, one thing to think about, I mean, I'm certainly not in favor of protecting non-native species, but this one is one that doesn't probably do too much damage other than taking up a little bit of space. All right, and we don't have any flowers of it to show you, unfortunately. We're going to look at a couple other species here, or maybe three more. Since again we are in an area where grasslands are kind of a dominant system, I thought I'd just pull up a few grasses here real quick and show you some grasses that are common out here. This one here is a panic grass, Dicanthelium, and with the size of the leaves, if I take a peek at the ligule here with my hand lens, I'm pretty sure this one is Dicanthelium oligosantes, which is Scribner's panic grass. The panic grasses are native cool season grasses. There are several species in Iowa, but this is probably the most common one you would see in again these pasture grassland types of environments, older degraded prairies. Another grass that is kind of specialized and one that you don't see all the time, but we see in sandy habitats, such as we're in right now, or other drier, low fertility types of environments, is this one right here. And this is a warm season grass. We can tell that again because it is right in the midst of producing its flowers and fruits here. This one is called Paspalum, Paspalum cetaceum. And again, it is a species that's typically only really found in drier environments, low fertility environments. A sandy environment such as this, of course, creates an environment that is somewhat drier because of the higher porosity of the soil, and any kind of precipitation or rain will percolate down through the soil more quickly. The soil can't hold onto the water quite as well as a more loamy soil. But you also should realize that sandy environments, sandy soils also usually have a lower fertility as well. So paspalum, it's a pretty easy one to recognize. Another common name for it would be bead grass, because when you look at the fruits here and the flowering structure, it looks like a series of beads. All right, that is Paspalum cetaceum. Another one that I've seen quite a bit of as we walked around this morning here is this one right here. And this would be one, again, that you would find in these kinds of environments. Again, an environment that, again, has a grassland history, a native grassland history, some type of prairie, but probably has a heavy grazing history as well, as this site undoubtedly has. It was heavily grazed, I'm sure, when it was privately owned. And this is horse nettle. One thing that grazing does is it helps to increase and favor the species that we call grazing increasers. That means the species is benefited by the grazing. And these are typically species that have some type of sharp, pointy structure, as the term I usually use to describe them, either a prickle, this is what this one has, little sharp prickles on the stem, or a spine, or a thorn. This one is in flower or fruit right now. This one does not have any flowers or fruits on it, but it will make a little berry-like fruit. Solanum carolinense is the scientific name. This is, again, horse nettle. I have another spot. We can look at 4 species or so here. Again, species that are adapted to open grassland environments, some history of disturbance here. The first one we're going to take a look at here is this clump of grasses right here in front of me. And you can kind of maybe see with the light and the dew on the grass is kind of sparkling. This is, it has a little bit of a purple tint. So these inflorescences here, these structures that we see here, again, the flowering structure, are really diffuse branch structures. So I can get a better one here. They're really kind of hard to see too. Very slender, branched, highly branched, and they have little tiny spikelets, the structures that contain the flowers and grasses, out towards the tips of the branches. Pretty hard to see, but maybe against my hand, there you can kind of see the size of those tiny spikelets. Well, this one, the gestalt on this one is very helpful. The fact that we see this purplish tint in the light, the fact that it has these inflorescences that are very diffuse and very spreading with these slender branches, these little spikelets out towards the tip. This is purple lovegrass, Eragrostis spectabilis, another species I would expect to find in a site like this, one that is somewhat adapted to drier soils. One of the things to help separate this from anything else that would be similar is to look at the inflorescence. I'll try and get just one here, the center branch of the inflorescence, and where these branches meet, these slender branches arise off of this central axis. It's going to be hard to see, of course, without a hand lens or a scope, but one of the characteristics for purple lovegrass is there'll be a very conspicuous little dense tuft of hairs right around, again, where the branches are attached. So right at the tip of my thumb there is where these slender branches are attached to the main axis. And again, with a hand lens, you'd be able to see some little clump of hairs there. I can kind of see it on some of them, just looking at that area again without a hand lens. You can see some little hairs again clumped up right there at the junction of that branch and the central stem. So purple lovegrass. Another warm season grass, native grass. It is nothing I would call, a problem species or invasive. It's a good species to have, though, if you're in this type of environment. All right, let's take a look at, What else is right here in front of me? Here's another native species that some of you probably know or recognize. It's all done with its flowers. This is hoary vervain, characterized by leaves that are sessile. So there's really not any petiole here at all. Leaves are pretty much sessile. The base of the leaf is attached right to the stem right there. Opposite leaves, they have fairly broadly elliptic leaves here, toothed margins. And then, of course, the flowering structure up here, which again is now showing and displaying the fruits, but several long columns of spikes. These would be called a spike because the flowers that were here were attached by their bases to this column. Remember, what happens here is the flowers, after they're done, the ovary of the flowers matures into a fruit. So now instead of seeing flowers, we're seeing lots and lots of fruits. But just this elongated central axis sticking up above the leaves like this. When it was in flower, again, you would have seen a dense row of bluish flowers here. So Verbena stricta, hoary vervain, is another species that would be characterized as a grazing increaser. Cows do not really like it. They don't graze on it. And so in a grazing situation, it gets passed up. And the grasses and other plants around it get grazed. So that is favorable, of course, to it. And that's why, again, when you see an overgrazed pasture, often you see a lot of this. So it could be somewhat of a slightly aggressive species, but it would be in a situation where there's probably too much grazing going on. That again is hoary vervain, Verbena stricta. Now we'll look at one here that is really characteristic, again, of this environment that we're in. Many of you probably know wild bergamot, Monarda pistilosa, pretty well, a common species in tallgrass prairie and savannas. Often widely used, of course, in prairie seedings. It's a good species for pollinators. Well, this is its shorter and more drier adapted cousin, so to speak, Monarda punctata, dotted bee balm, or dotted bergamot that grows in sandy environments. You see it bears a little resemblance to Monarda pistilosa. Not quite the same in terms of the flowering structure. We see a series of groups of flowers at the tips of these branches here. But it has the same square stems, similar looking leaves as Monarda pistilosa, wild bergamot. But again, in species of dry, sandy types of environments. Monarda punctata.
Okay, we will pause at this point. Does anyone have any questions on any of the species that Tom presented? I'll pause for a short while. You can unmute yourself or you can use the chat area. I've got a question. The hairy vervain, I see that in row dishes and such. So I'm assuming, as you said, it's more of a native species that grows where there is disturbance, and succession-wise, it probably is not a plant that's going to stick around. Is that right?
Yeah, that's pretty close. I think you're right on target there. It is, and probably more of an early successional species. It is favored by disturbances, especially grazing, as I said. I know that from seed bank studies I've done that it can reside in the seed bank as a fairly dominant species. In other words, maintain viable seeds below ground in the soil. And essentially what those plants are doing that are capable of that, they're waiting for a disturbance to come along and give them an opportunity to grow without so much competition. So grazing or fire, anything that removes some of the above ground plant growth, would open up a window for those seeds to grow. It would kind of fade away, I think, as the ecosystem advanced through succession to later stages and more competitive perennial species. Perhaps, we're starting to take hold and provide more competition.
Okay, I'm not seeing any questions. So Tiffany, go ahead and keep the video going. Thanks.
We've moved around a little bit. We found a patch here of species that truly is an invasive species, a very bad invasive species that we haven't covered it yet, I don't believe. So this is what we want to spend a little time on talking about. It's one that you probably, most of you maybe can recognize without any problem. But if you haven't got experience with it, well, then we'll teach you a little bit about it right now. So there's a dense thicket of it right through here. It's multiflora rose, Rosa multiflora. It was introduced, many years ago as a way of building a living fence and probably for wildlife cover, wildlife habitat, wildlife food, and it was of course, a huge mistake. So it's a rose. So it's going to be similar to many of the native roses in terms of, its flower and its leaves. Roses have compound leaves. This is all a leaf right here with its 7 leaflets. Roses also have a lot of prickles. Prickles are the sharp, pointy structures, again, that arise out of the epidermis of the stem. So again, this is one that is very difficult to move through or walk through, almost impossible sometimes. So how do you distinguish this from a native rose? Well, one way is when it's in flower. This is going to have white flowers, and the native roses always have some type of pink or rose or sort of dark pink flower. But vegetatively, there are some native roses that get this big and get this sort of sprawling. So there could be some similarity that might make it difficult for you. Many of the prairie roses are a lot smaller than this, but there are some native roses that do grow taller and more shrub size, and even get 6 to 8 feet tall, which this certainly can't. So what you need to look for on the roses to really nail this down as multiflora rose is the roses have little structures called stipules, and the stipules are paired little structures that are attached to the base of the leaf, right at the base of the petiole. The stipules are considered to be a part of the leaf. A leaf is composed of the blades, which are photosynthetic, composed of a petiole, and in a compound leaf, the rachis, which is this part right here, which the leaflets are attached to, and then, in some cases, stipules, again, attached to the base of the petiole. And in roses, these stipules are fused to the lower part of the petiole. My little finger is pointing to the stipules here. What makes multiflora rose different is the stipules in multiflora rose have these ciliate little hairs that come off of the margin of the stipules. In the native roses, you would see the stipules; they would be there, but there would not be these little ciliate hairs. Hoping that you can see those there. They're pretty obvious, pretty easy to see. You can see them without a hand lens. So all it takes is just one quick glance at the stipules, and if it has those little hairy structures there, you've got multiflora rose. And this is one that we'll talk a little bit about some of the ways this can be controlled in the webinar. All right, well, here is the wetland, one of the namesakes of this site here, the namesake, Chia Fen. So we're looking at a wetland out here in front of us. We can see a bunch of pondweed growing along the margin here, a lot of duckweed and watermeal probably out there on the surface of this wetland. It's somewhat dry. We can see there's some mud along the margin, so the water level is a little bit low. This is Chia Fen. So in some people's minds, this is a fen. This is what they would call a a nutrient poor fen. In other people's interpretations, and that includes myself, I look at this and I would rather use a hydrological type of definition to separate wetlands. And because this clearly has a basin, we walk down a slope. If you look around this wetland here, we are in a basin. We are in a lower spot that receives drainage and rainwater. It undoubtedly does have some groundwater connection, but a fair amount of the water that comes in here is derived from surface flow in here and rain. And because it's in this basin and some of the other characteristics of the site, the term bog is a little bit more appropriate. This is not the best one. The better example of a bog is actually a little bit further to the north. But this is a nice wetland to take a look at here. We're going to see some wetland species here. Again, I think 3 of these are native. One of them's not. So we'll start with what we see right here next to me. And the first one we'll take a look at here is smartweed. This smartweed right here. Smartweeds are a good species to find this time of year. They bloom at the end of the growing season pretty much. And this is a real easy one to identify when you look at it this time of year because of the way that the flowering structures here, the inflorescences droop like this. They have small little white flowers associated with them. If we look real close at those flowers, we can see some other good characteristics for this species, but really don't need to do that because there's enough right here to tell me that this is Persicaria lepathifolium. Persicaria lepathifolium. Another one that's blooming this time of year again, late in the growing season, and is common in these wetland environments is this one right here with the composite flowers. It's in the Asteraceae family. So it's got ray flowers and disc flowers there, all in the same head. This one also is easy to identify based on just the gestalt of it right here. This is Bidens cernua. So the Bidens genus is often also called beggar ticks. So this species has opposite leaves. Look down here a little bit further down here. We can see these leaves are opposite and they are sessile. In fact, here's another example a bit further down. The base of the leaves are almost adjoined, touching each other at least right here. The leaf on this side and the leaf on this side, their bases meet right here at the stem. So having leaves that are opposite and sessile and almost clasping, basically clasping or wrapping around the stem, combined with the way that the inflorescence up here, the flower heads, are tilting somewhat and a little bit drooping, pointing straight up like this one is right here. They eventually turn and start pointing downward, somewhat downward like that one right there. That droopingness of the flower head is what the species name cernua means. Bidens cernua, again, is the scientific name for this. Nodding, cernua means nodding, and nodding, again, is interpreted to be the way that the flower head is bending over and pointing somewhat down. So Bidens cernua, nodding beggar ticks. This, again, is the smartweed. And a couple of grasses right here. So let's do this one first. This one I collected from a little bit further out there, closer to the margin of the wetland. This one is a barnyard grass. And in Iowa, there's 3 species, but there's really only 2 that are very common and you're likely to run into. One of them native, Echinocloa mericata, and one of them non-native, Echinocloa cruscalii. And this is another one that when I am doing surveys, I don't try to figure out in the field. I just grab the top of this and throw it in a plastic bag and take it with me. take it back home, and because really to determine for sure which species it is, you're going to have a dissecting scope, so you can look at the tips of these spikelets. They're really small, of course, and it's even hard to do with a hand lens. I can give it a try here. But the characteristic you're looking for is pretty small. This one looks like it's probably the native species, Echinochlora muricata. Again, I would not trust just my hand lens. I want to take a little bit of this back with me and look at it under a scope with higher power. What you're looking at is one of the structures of the flower here. It's a structure called a glume. There's a glume, and then there's a structure called a lemma. You're going to be looking at the lemma that's associated with the flower and looking at the tip of that and seeing if that tip is firm and hard or whether it's soft and more herbaceous. So it's a characteristic that is hard to see unless you have enough magnification. But it's a barnyard grass. We know that much. And then the last one that there's a lot of right through here is this one right here, which is a really good characteristic of wet soils where we're standing right here. This is rice cutgrass. So rice cutgrass is in the genus Learsia. The genus Learsia, and there's a couple other species that you could see in Iowa, is pretty easy to identify as a genus. If you look at the nodes, the node is this structure right here, this kind of swollen area along the stem. A node is where the leaves are attached. So the sheath of this leaf right here, this is the leaf blade, the sheath of this leaf runs all the way down, then attaches to the stem right here at this node. I can see it without my hand lens, but what's characteristic about the nodes on Learsia, the cut grasses and also white grass, which would be found in forest environments, is that there's downward pointing hairs, somewhat stiff downward pointing hairs on that node. So again, if you see that on the node, that's a really good sign that you're looking at Learsia, at least the genus. And the two species that are the most common are rice cut grass found in wet soil environments and white grass found in forest environments. Rice cut grass is also somewhat easy to identify from the white grass by just feeling this. If you feel this with your fingers, I'm rubbing my hands upward along the sheath here, I can feel really a lot of roughness. That's because there's a lot of downward pointing sharp little hairs on this sheath. And that's where it kind of gets its name, rice cut grass, because these little downward hairs, if you were to be walking through here with shorts or these brushed up against your skin, there certainly is a good possibility that that they would cut your skin. You might be bleeding a little bit when you come out of the patch of rice cut grass. Learsia or rhizoides is a scientific name for this one, and Learsia virginica is a scientific name for white grass. All right, our next stop.
Okay, so Tom, I have a question for you. So the rice cutgrass, is that a native species?
Yes, both of those are native. The Learsia virginica and or rhizoides, both are native species. And
Okay.
rice cutgrass would be one that, if you were doing wetland restoration work, it would certainly be a species that you could put in there. Certainly it might find its own way in there as well. It might be possibly present in the seed bank, depending upon the land use history. But that would be a good herbaceous grassy species.
Another question for you, a related question for you. So the rice cutgrass, we're going to focus on the root structure, but is that, I'm wondering if Nate Hogeveen from DNR mentioned that along stream banks and that being a good species to use along stream banks for holding soil in place. Do you know anything about that?
No, I don't think it has an especially
Okay.
strongly developed root system. I was just going to take a quick look here and see what it says here on Flora of North America. It is perennial and it is rhizomatous. I do remember now seeing the rhizomes when I pulled it up. I don't think it necessarily gets very deep, though. So it could provide some surface protection, I suppose, because of its growth. But as
Okay.
far as going deeper into the ground to help really hold soil on the bank, it might not do so well there.
Okay. All right. And Tiffany has a question. What mistakes do you see others make when trying to control multiflora rows?
Oh, multiflora rose, yes, that is one that I hope we could talk a little bit about because it is a pretty common invasive species and it is a difficult one to control. I would say, it kind of depends upon the situation, how much of it you have, how large of an area you're dealing with. Um, you could use a variety of approaches. Probably what I would probably try the most if I had a problem with it would be to use a brush cutter and go in and brush cut the large clumps. It can be so difficult to deal with because of the very sharp and large prickles that develop on the stems on the canes. And of course, it can be very sprawling and spreading, very bushy, so to speak. And so it can be really hard to get in there and kind of work with it. So, a steel brush cutter, for example, with, you can reach in there underneath those and use a steel blade to cut those off is easier than trying to crawl in there and use a saw. And so you'd probably just, cut it and leave it lay, I suppose, unless you had some way of grasping onto them and pulling them and piling them up. When I have dealt with it, I have used leather gloves and such and grabbed onto them and pulled them from the location where they were cut and put them onto a pile. If you had a lot of it, I suppose you'd probably want to do that, but that would be an option. You'd have to decide whether it's worth the work. But then what you're going to want to do, what a lot of methods will say is, of course, you should try and treat those cut stems with triclopyr. But I find that to be very difficult to do because, again, the stems usually are not that large. We're talking about maybe pencil size to maybe a little bit larger stems, and so actually treating them with triclopyr can be hard. So I kind of like to do what I do with honeysuckles and other shrub woody species like that, and that's cut them and then let them wait until they resprout, and that could be just a little bit later, the same growing season, or it could be the next year. But when they resprout and start producing leaves on those sprouts, you've got a really good target now for a foliar spray. And I would use something like triclopyr, but in a formulation that's used to spray the leaves. There's some other formulations that include triclopyr and dicamba and some other herbicides in combination that might provide a little bit more killing power, you might say. But I see really good success with that because then you can, if you treat the resprouts when they're fairly short, there's really not that much foliage there yet, and so it doesn't take very much spray to cover them. And again, this is new growth, and so it's pretty actively growing, and it will translocate that herbicide to the root system. And I've seen pretty good success again getting the shrubs killed. If you had a larger area, you might consider, using a tractor and mower, to do the mowing work, of course, rather than a brush cutter. A tractor with a brush mower, in a sense, a three-point brush mower would probably work pretty well. Again, you're going to have to come back in somehow though and treat the sprouts. There are a couple of biological species, biological. I wouldn't say they're not really controls because they're not really approved to be used as a biological control, but there are a couple of biologicals that can have an effect on rose growth, and the people listening might know of these. The rosette disease is a disease that will kill multiflora rose. There was some research, for quite a while done at Iowa State on it, but it's not. And what it is a virus that gets transmitted by a small mite from plant to plant. But it's not anything that can be really approved for sort of wholesale use, because the virus will also attack other roses, native species of rose, and even spread into plums as well. So that doesn't work, of course. There's also a small wasp-like insect that has been imported from Japan that will attack the seeds. And so it's a seed predator. And that can be, again, could be helpful in cutting back on the amount of seeds that are produced. It's not going to really necessarily kill the plant, though. But that hasn't been approved either. So we're left with some type of mechanical and chemical approach. And persistence is always important. And I think I said this before with other species. Usually it's going to take a couple of different types of stresses. A combination of cutting and then following up with herbicide is I think one of the most effective.
Okay, and there was one comment from Mark. When you see red rosette, or maybe say or C, yes, I believe that is the disease they get. Should we just leave those and hope they spread it to others?
Well, good question. I think if you're in an area that there's not much of a remnant component, native plant component, then you'd probably be worthwhile, letting that happen, letting the mites again spread them from plant to plant, because that is going to be somewhat of an effective method of reducing it. The rose rosette disease is pretty fatal. The problem is that if it's in a situation where, if it's a possibility that it can spread to a remnant where there's native prairie roses, then that's not what you want, of course. And I don't know for sure how likely that is to happen, but it is certainly the case that the disease will also kill native species, and as I said, even spread into the plum genus and or wild cherry, and it might kill some of those species too. So maybe, I guess, is if it's in a pasture and there's pretty much all you've got is just roses and nothing else that you need to be concerned about there, then it would probably be fine to let it spread.
Okay, all right, thank you, Tom. So Tiffany, we are ready to start the video again.
We decided to go into the more shaded areas here. Again, the site here is a combination of open degraded prairie, pasture grassland, old pasture grassland, and then degraded savanna areas and some areas that would be more of a forest, thicker tree cover. So we're going to do a little quick segment on the woody stuff that we see right here along this edge. So we'll start with this dogwood right here. So dogwoods are native species, of course, to Iowa. They can be considered a little bit of an aggressive species, of course, on prairies, native prairies in particular. Probably not so much of a problem on reconstructed sites, but native prairies. The dogwoods are characterized by having these opposite simple leaves and veination that you can kind of see maybe in the back here. You always see the veins a little bit better on the back. The veins that the side veins come off the main vein here like this, and then they tend to sort of curve and kind of follow the edges of the leaf a little bit before tapering off. It's going to be hard to see probably, but one characteristic that can be used is to tear the leaf in along the margin and then look to see if in that tear you see some little threads that are connecting the veins on either side of that tear. Dogwoods will have little elastic threads that persist and join again the two broken ends of that vein. Now, so dogwoods as a whole, showing or identifying them as cornus, as a dogwood isn't too hard usually. Identifying which dogwood can be a little bit harder. You're usually going to have to look at the leaf, and in this case, look at the pubescence of the leaves on both the bottom and top. And based on the pubescence, this one looks like it's Cornus drummondii, rough leaf dogwood. And it's characterized by having just a pretty substantial amount of hairs and pubescence on both sides, especially on the bottom. All right, yeah, I think this one is Cornus drummondii, rough leaf dogwood. Right next to it here is a liana. I can separate it out here somewhat. That again, in woodland restorations, savanna restorations, you're probably going to have to deal with. This is a native species, greenbrier, that could be a problem species, I suppose, in some environments, depending upon how dense it is. A liana is a woody plant that has the capacity to climb on other plants. So it has little tendrils, structures that can help it attach to other plants and hang on to other plants and make its way up onto other plants, up onto trees. It usually has fairly green looking stems and leaves. Again, here's an example of the leaves. Have some really strong venation in there. And it's going to have a fair amount of prickles. In fact, in some cases, the prickles on this species can be really dense and really thick. Greenbrier can have stems that you would never want to grasp onto with your hand because there's so many prickles. Greenbrier, and then over here, this one is a species that can be, again, it's a native species, but can be somewhat problematic in understories that have gotten just too dense with woody growth. This is prickly ash. So prickly ash is characterized by having these compound leaves. This is all one leaf right here with leaflets. One of the helpful characteristics for prickly ash is the fact that I think you can see this pretty well here if I get this in the light, is it's got two stipules. Remember those stipules we were talking about with the roses? These stipules are modified to make sharp, pointy things, and since the stipules are a part of the leaf, and when you have a leaf that becomes sharp and pointy, we call that a spine. These are spines. So two little paired spines occur right at the base of the leaf on prickly ash. Has again, compound leaf, much like ash trees do, but again, the name prickly ash here should be a name that is used with a hyphen between prickly and ash, because it's not really an ash. It's not in the same family as green ash. Ash trees have leaves that are opposite, and you can see these leaves are not. So prickly ash, again, can get dense in the understory, but what I've seen in places where prescribed fire has been used fairly consistently, that it's pretty susceptible to fire. The stems have thin bark towards the base, and so any kind of heat from a fire is pretty effective in girdling those stems, causing enough heat to penetrate the stem to destroy the phloem tissue so that the above ground part of the plant dies. So I think with timely fires, prickly ash can be reduced if there's too much of it. But again, remember, it is native, just like the dogwood's native and greenbrier is. So they should have at least some place in a forest or woodland. Over here on this side of me, we can see some red. Well, I will say this is an oak that's in the red oak group because, again, of the bristles, little tiny bristles that come off the lobes on these leaves. So there's two groups of oaks, the red oak group and the white oak group. The red oak group includes things like red oak and black oak and pin oak. And so they have the bristle tips. Now, which one it is here, that gets a little bit harder. I'm going to look at the buds here on this one. Since they're close enough to see. And it's especially hard with the oaks when you're dealing with a smaller example, with just a small shrub, a small individual, because they're going to be in the shade of other trees generally, and that means their leaves are going to be not as diagnostic. They can be a lot larger than leaves normally would be. You can see these are leaves of an oak here as well. It looks like that based on the hairiness on this bud, and that's a good characteristic for black oak. If the buds are pubescent, that's going to separate it from red oak. And black oak is a species that is typically found in sandy soils. So I'm sure there's both black oak and white oak here. Maybe some red oak, maybe some bur oak too. Lastly, we'll take a look at this little shrub right down here in front of me. This is another one that could be considered somewhat aggressive and a problem in understories and savannas or in prairies. This is buckbrush. Oh, maybe not. I will take that back. This is a young honeysuckle. And looking at the leaves a little bit better, my first glance, I thought it was a little buckbrush, but nope. It's a honeysuckle, just a real small version of it. And I can tell that again by the shape of these leaves. These leaves have a tip that is attenuate. The tip comes out here and rapidly slenders down. So there's sort of a concave edge to the leaf right there. And then you have this tip that's somewhat drawn out. That's what the term acuminate means. And this is a really good example of what, again, a leaf on Lonicera mackii, the bush honeysuckle, looks like. So this one is an invasive species, one of the worst ones.
Okay, let's see. So we did have sort of one question, but excuse me. And then Colleen, you sort of answered yourself, but the dogwoods that are planted as ornamental trees, are those typically native or non-native? And probably one of the more commonly ones would be the red twig dogwood.
Yeah, so red osier dogwood is often planted. I've seen it planted by the DOT along roadsides. Red osier dogwood has the reddish twigs. That's an important characteristic to separate from other dogwoods. It is native to Iowa, but it's only native to the northern counties. So it's an example, again, of what happens with, a lot of plant species. When we say a plant's native to Iowa, that doesn't usually mean the entire state. It just means that, of course, someplace within the state, the species naturally occurs or had its natural range. So again, if you were up in northern Iowa, it would be certainly fine to use it as a species. It would be a species you'd find naturally in wetter soils, wetland areas, margins of wetlands. Again, it's planted, I guess, along roads as a windbreak species. It would, like other dogwoods, of course, and other shrub species, would form a nice short windbreak that would help catch snow. I've seen it planted on the west side of roads. Down in central Iowa, it's not native, no. So, you know, it wouldn't be a correct species to plant here.
Okay. Do you, I know red, I'm used to calling them red twig dogwoods, but red osier dogwood. Do you know, I've seen some of them used for stream bank stabilization projects. Do you know anything
Yeah, that would be a good species for that. Shrub species like willows or dogwoods, would, I think, provide good a function. And one of their functions would be to help stabilize stream banks with their root growth, or their woody growth is going to produce root systems that are woody as well. And unlike grasses, which we always kind of think of as, again, another species with this root growth that can really help to hold soil. That's certainly true, but remember, the grasses, their roots are going to die. Those are herbaceous roots, and so they're going to die during the winter season. They're not going to be, as much of a factor during that time of the year, whereas woody plants with the woody root systems, those roots are going to stay there. So I think, a combination probably, or at least, the idea of using shrub species. I think shrub species are probably going to be a better choice than anything taller or, more of a tree species. Those shrub species that form dense thickets because of their rhizomatous growth, are going to probably provide the best hope for helping to stabilize the soil.
Okay, all right. So let's see, Tiffany, do we have more video left?
That should be it.
That should be it. Whoops, hang on. Okay, anyone, you can unmute yourselves or you can use the chat. Any questions at all on any of the species that Tom introduced, as well as any of the management of those species as well? Are waiting on that. So as far as the dogwoods go, do they reach a point, if they're native, do they reach a point where they can be invasive or sort of not preferred, or not so much?
Oh, sure. Yes, it certainly can. We see that all the time in prairies with especially rough leaf dogwood, because once they would again naturally be a part of the ecotone area between prairies and forest environment, maybe again lower in the landscape, down where forest naturally would be. There's this area, transition area, between what would be a forest and what would be a grassland at ecotone that usually has shrub species. And again, they would be a natural part there. So shrubs are supposed to be out there on the landscape, and they provide important wildlife habitat for a number of bird species. They provide good wildlife food. The problem is that, without especially prescribed fire management, I've seen many examples, especially in the Loess Hills, where that shrub component just, keeps encroaching out into the prairie. It starts to transform the environment below it with its shading, and opens up then the opportunity for tree species, and particularly green ash, elms, mulberries, to then get established in the more shaded, cooler, moist soil environment that's underneath the shrub. So it's very easy to see, in especially the Loess Hills landscapes and maybe some other prairie landscapes, where shrubs have just, essentially gradually and continually, in the absence of fire, invaded up into prairie lands, and sort of following that first wave of shrubs a little bit further down slope. For example, in the Loess Hills, you see a second wave of young trees. So it's just a matter again of striking a balance. There should be some shrubs out there along the edges between the prairies and the forest, but there should also be enough of often enough fire management use that it pushes back on their continued advancement out into the prairie. Because if left to that, I mean, the only other thing that's going to stop them basically is if they get into environments that's simply too dry. But especially on north and east facing slopes, that's not going to happen, and they can take over an entire prairie.
Okay, and we do have a question. We do have a question from Daniel. If you want to unmute yourself, you can go ahead and ask your question.
All righty. Well, thanks, Tom, for videos you put together. Always enjoy visiting with you and plant communities out there. A question I had that you had in an earlier video, you mentioned yellow sweet clover and white sweet clover as possibly being the same species or maybe going to be reclassified as the same species. I'm wondering if you could visit on that.
Yeah, that is the sign, I guess, or that's the information I'm getting. The Flora of North America for Fabaceae hasn't been published yet, so that is still, we're still awaiting that to happen to see what the expert is going to be saying, I guess, about that. But I've heard from some taxonomists, I think it might have been Deb Lewis at Iowa State, I'm not sure now, that based on I guess something that they've read or they've heard is that that is the consensus now, that those are really just two subspecies, we might call them, or two varieties of the same species. It kind of makes sense to me because they're just, I can't see any other difference between them other than just the color of the flowers. There's a little bit of a difference, I think, in when they flower. It seems to me yellow blooms maybe a little bit earlier, tends to bloom a little bit sooner in the growing season than white. But that, again, that's not necessarily enough of a distinction to call them a separate species. If they're able to, we apply the biological species rule, which basically says that if two individuals are able to mate, if they're able to produce fertile and viable offspring, then that is a sign that they, of course, belong to the same gene pool. They belong to the same species. So I suspect that's probably the case there. I think in general, well, again, I'm not a taxonomist. I don't study the genes. I don't do molecular work, but I spend a lot of time out in the field, I guess, looking at how plants grow and sort of what I see as the natural amount of variation and plasticity in plants. I just have a feeling that someone who's really just a taxonomist, doesn't have that field time maybe per se. They can be excited about the idea when they see some differences, some morphological differences between some plants, that right away they think that must be something that's associated with separating them into different species. And I just, I don't think that's always the right move, because again, I think they fail to have a good appreciation for the just the amount of individual variation and plasticity that plants can achieve, especially out in the real world, again, growing in different environments. That's one of the strategies that plants rely on, I think, most heavily to respond to changes in the environment is being what we call plastic, which is another way of saying that is to acclimate to the environment that they're in right at the moment. And again, if we don't recognize that, instead we attribute that difference in variation to genetic basis, then that's what starts leading us down the road to saying that they're different varieties, different subspecies, or even different species. But the final word on that, I guess we'll have to wait and see. I'll take a look, I guess, and see if I can find any papers on it. But Flora of North America is what I use as my Bible for plant nomenclature, and unfortunately, that has not been produced yet for the Fabaceae.
Thanks, Tom.
Okay. Thanks for your question, Daniel. And we do have a question or comment from Mark, probably a little both, a little off topic. But I remember Dr. Rosberg saying he was going to burn late in his prairie due to the anticipated drought to knock back some cool seasons. While we had the drought, did you see any changes in the established prairie plants or reduction in the cool seasons?
Yes, I did burn, and that's in reference to burning a little bit later in the spring season rather than mid-season or early spring. You know, spring technically starts March 21st. So burning into mid-April, or excuse me, mid-May, early to mid-May, would be considered, burning more in the late spring. And I would say I most definitely have seen that was a very good move this year, because areas that I did burn that had brome, the brome barely survived, it looks like, has survived this growing season. It came back, of course, it is perennial, but the growth on it barely reached 6 inches. And the warm season growth that's in there, that's intermixed with it, there's at least some warm season growth. That's the issue again, trying to reduce the brome and get more warm season growth and get more, open up more space for forbs. Those warm season grasses, of course, are doing just fine. They were 6 foot tall, big blue stem, and the brome was clearly highly stressed. And I think I've seen it on other areas too that I know were burned. Well, one area was Doolittle Prairie. I know that Story County burned a portion of Doolittle Prairie where I do monthly prairie walks. They burned at April 20th or so, which wasn't quite as late as I'd like to see. But even there, by burning on April 20th, again, I watched that during the growing season because I was there each month. We saw, again, substantial stress imposed on that brome. Now, again, what does that mean longer term? We'll see, but anytime you see brome struggling to come back and only produce about 6 inches of growth after the burn and, during the growing season, I mean, it clearly means it's pretty stressed out.
Okay, let's see. I am not seeing any other questions, and I don't see any raised hands. So that could mean only one thing. I think that is probably it. So many thanks, Tom, for sharing your expertise and for the road trips this year, looking at weeds and invasives. And thank you, Tiffany, for the behind the scenes video editing. And thanks to Noah. He hasn't joined us today, but that was his first outdoor video. So anyway, but thank you all for joining us. We will be, you're welcome, Mark. Thank you for putting this on. So if you have an opportunity now, you could, in the chat, provide us any suggestions. Is there something that you would like to hear next year? Would you like road tours next year? Is there something that you would like to focus on? So let us know. Colleen, thanks you as well, Tom, for your sharing your expertise. So thanks everyone for joining us. We enjoyed as usual, and I think those of us that take the video learn a lot from Tom as well about plants, and their characteristics.
Well, it's always very fun to go on the road and see what we can find. I'm glad that there's at least a few people that like to see these, and yeah, makes sense that if we can do it again next summer, we could try that.
Yeah, and the interesting thing is, we never know what we're going to find when we go to these sites. It's not like we know exactly which plants we're going to find or trees, but so it's always a mystery. So it's a lot of fun.
Right.
But, well, thanks again, Tom. Thanks all of you for joining us. Tiffany will be sending out certificates of participation for those of you that need those for professional development hours. And we did record this video. If you all need links to the video, let us, either Tiffany or I, Pat Sauer, know. Just give us a little time to get those uploaded. But that is what we have for you all today. Take care and have a great rest of your day.
All right.